Welcome to Richie Rich Stories. Please subscribe, like, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any story. Every story on this channel is carefully researched and written by us, with real effort and passion, created to give you something meaningful and worth your time. Now, let me leave you with our narrator and the story of Mercedes-Benz.
Mercedes-Benz, the star, the myth, and the shadows. The dawn of August 5, 1888, in Mannheim, Germany, did not arrive with a celebration. It arrived with a sound, a single-cylinder engine, metallic, unsteady, like a machine trying to wake up. In the quiet of early morning, a woman named Bertha Benz, 39 years old, did something that would change the modern world. She performed an act that for her time felt almost rebellious. She took her husband's invention without asking. She did not request permission. She did not wait for approval. She moved first. Her husband, Carl Benz, was a brilliant engineer, but he was also a man trapped by doubt. The public mocked his horseless carriage. People laughed at the idea of a vehicle with no horse. Carl felt the weight of every insult. He built carefully, but he hesitated to prove his machine in the wild. He wanted perfection before exposure. Bertha understood something deeper. An invention is not real until it works outside the workshop. That morning, she quietly woke her teenage sons, Richard and Ugon. They did not start the engine in front of the house. The sound was too loud. If Carl heard it, the trip could end instantly. So the three of them pushed the vehicle slowly and silently several hundred yards away. Only then, in a safer radius of silence, they started the engine. The air was cool and damp. The scene smelled of oil, metal, and a fuel called ligroin, a petroleum solvent used for cleaning. The machine itself looked fragile. 3 wheels, thin frame, more like a strange tricycle than a future empire. It coughed into life with a small engine, about 1.6 liters, making less than 1 horsepower. By modern standards, it was weak, but in 1888, it was a declaration. And then Bertha Benz did something no one had truly done before. She took this experimental vehicle on a long-distance journey, about 106 kilometers, toward Pforzheim. This was not a casual drive, it was a test of survival. The stakes were not only technical, they were personal. Carl had poured years into this invention, and Bertha had invested her own resources into their life together. If this machine failed publicly, it could collapse the dream, and maybe the family's future. The road to Pforzheim became a battlefield of small disasters.
When the fuel line clogged, Bertha didn't panic. She didn't search for a mechanic that did not exist. She reached into her hair, pulled out a long hat pin, and cleared the blockage herself. When an ignition wire frayed, she did not stop the journey. She used her garter as insulation. Then another problem appeared. An ignition wire started to fray. The engine needed insulation fast. There was no shop, no spare parts, no right tool for the job. So Bertha used what she had. She took her garter, a simple piece of clothing, and wrapped it around the damaged wire. It worked like insulation, keeping the wire from shorting and stopping the engine. It sounds small, almost unbelievable, but that is the truth of this journey. The first long car trip was not powered only by fuel, it was powered by improvisation. When the wooden brakes began to smoke and burn on steep descents, she stopped in the village of Bauschlat and found a cobbler, not a mechanic, a cobbler. She demanded leather be fitted onto the brake blocks. In that moment, she helped create a concept the world now takes for granted, brake lining, an early version of brake pads. And then, as the sun climbed higher, the fuel ran out. The vehicle carried only a small amount of fuel. There were no gas stations, no fuel pumps, no roadside service. So Bertha drove into the town of Wieslot and walked into a pharmacy. She asked for Ligrum.
A confused chemist sold her a cleaning solvent that, in that moment, became fuel. That pharmacy is often remembered as the world's first filling station. If you want one image that explains the birth of the automobile industry, it might be this: an aristocratic woman, covered in dust and oil, negotiating for cleaning fluid to feed a metal beast while the world is still laughing. By the time she reached Pforzheim and sent word back to Karl, the horseless carriage was no longer a weird experiment. It was a tool. It could travel. It could endure. It could change life. And that's the first secret of Mercedes history. Before the engineers, before the executives, before the advertising, the real beginning was proof. But now comes the twist. Because the Mercedes-Benz origin story is often told as one clean legend with one straight timeline, in reality it was messy. It was a collision of minds and companies. It was a fight between different styles of genius. And it created a myth that people still argue about today. Who truly built the star? To understand Mercedes-Benz, you have to understand the two forces behind it.
First, Karl Benz, careful, methodical, a man of the lab. Second, Gottlieb Daimler, ambitious, secretive, obsessed with engines, and hungry for expansion. Karl Benz saw the car as a complete system: engine, frame, controls, one integrated invention. But Karl was haunted by insecurity. Public criticism hit him hard. He had genius, but he lacked commercial confidence. Bertha became his anchor, not only emotionally, but strategically. She saw what he did not. People don't believe in your invention because you say it works. They believe when they see it work. Daimler, on the other hand, was different. He did not worship the car, he worshipped the engine. He saw the car as just one use for a powerful, compact engine, an engine that could transform not just roads, but the world. Daimler wanted to motorize land, sea, and air. This idea becomes important later because it connects to the most famous symbol in the story, the three-pointed star. Daimler worked closely with Wilhelm Maybach, a collaborator often described as a true engineering artist, and they worked in extreme secrecy. In 1882, Daimler moved into a villa in Cannstatt, but the real work happened in a small building in his garden, often described as a converted greenhouse or garden house. Inside, the air was thick with hot oil and metal shavings. Early experiments created sharp smells, sparks, heat. It was the kind of workshop where a new century is born.
The secrecy became so intense that even servants were barred from entering. And according to the story, the secrecy created suspicion. The gardener heard midnight noise, constant hammering, metal hitting metal, and he called the police. His theory was almost funny. He thought Daimler and Maybach were running an illegal mint to forge coins. A midnight raid followed. The police found no counterfeit money, no fake coins. They found tools, gears, calipers, and a high-speed four-stroke engine. Not criminals, just men building the future. This moment matters because it shows something that stays in Mercedes' DNA. Mercedes' history is full of secrecy, experiments, and people who don't want outsiders watching too closely. And that is where conspiracy thinking starts to grow. Because when something is powerful and secretive, people fill the silence with theories. Let's talk about the biggest symbol, the star. The Mercedes three-pointed star is one of the most successful logos ever made. It is simple, sharp, and unforgettable.
The common explanation is that Daimler used the star to represent his dream of engines dominating land, sea, and air. Over time, that vision became a brand identity. But here is where the internet enters the story. Some people claim the star is more than a business symbol. They point to the shape and say it looks occult. They connect it to secret societies. They claim it is a hidden code. They say it represents control, domination, even global power. Let's be clear and grounded. There is no solid primary evidence that the star was designed as an occult symbol. Most of these claims are interpretations built after the fact because the logo is so clean and so strong that people want it to contain hidden meaning.
But even if the occult theory is not proven, the obsession with the star tells us something real. The symbol is not just a logo, it's a psychological device. It promises power. It promises status. It promises you made it. And that is not a conspiracy. That's just elite branding at its best. Now we move into the next turning point, because Mercedes did not truly become Mercedes through engineering alone. It became Mercedes through a naming deal that feels like a movie. Enter Emil Jelinek. Jelinek was an Austrian businessman and diplomat living in Nice. He loved speed. He loved glamour. He loved attention. He was exactly the kind of person who understood what rich buyers want. Not just performance, but identity. In 1896, he arrived demanding the fastest car Daimler could build. He wanted something that could dominate, especially in the racing culture around the Riviera. When early models did not satisfy him, he made a bold offer, an order so large it could change the company's future. He would buy dozens of cars, but on two conditions. First, he would control sales in major regions. Second, and most famous, those cars would be named after his daughter, Mercedes. This is where brand magic happens, because Daimler sounds industrial, heavy, German, mechanical, but Mercedes sounds elegant, light, exotic, like a gift. Even the meaning attached to the word helped, favors or gifts. The name fits a luxury dream. It is easier to love. So now Mercedes becomes not just a machine, but a character, a persona. And that sets the stage for the moment many called the birth of the modern automobile. In December 1900, the first Mercedes 35 HP was delivered. This car marked a shift. Earlier cars often looked like carriages with engines attached. The 35 HP was designed from the ground up for performance and stability. It had a lower center of gravity. It used advanced ideas for its time. It featured Maybach's honeycomb radiator, an innovation that became part of the brand's visual DNA. At the Nice Race Week in 1901, these cars dominated competition so clearly that observers said they had entered the era of Mercedes. This is a pattern you will see again and again. Mercedes does not only want to be good, it wants to be seen winning. Winning creates myth. Myth creates loyalty. Loyalty becomes money. But Mercedes' history is not a straight line of success. Even the most prestigious dynasties have moments of failure. Sometimes the failure is small and embarrassing. Sometimes it becomes a global headline. Two names come up again and again in Mercedes' flop conversations: the Vaneo and the A-Class Moose test. The Vaneo, launched in the early 2000s, is often remembered as a design and market failure. It was an attempt to enter a compact MPV market. Critics complained of quality and style. It didn't match the Mercedes image. But the Vaneo was nothing compared to the crisis of the late 1990s A-Class. A Swedish motoring magazine performed an avoidance test, often called the Moose test. The brand new A-Class rolled over.
For Mercedes, this was not just a product issue, it was an identity crisis. Mercedes sells safety, quality, and trust. If a Mercedes rolls over in a test, the whole promise feels broken. The company halted deliveries and invested heavily into fixes, including widespread stability technology. The cost was enormous. Whether every estimate is exact or not, the point is clear. Mercedes paid heavily to protect the bigger story. And here's another conspiracy-flavored truth. Mercedes has always acted like a brand that understands one rule: perception is survival. When your image is the best, any public crack becomes dangerous. Now, beyond individual models, Mercedes is also a story of design evolution. In the 80s and 90s, Mercedes design was often described as boxy and authoritative. Cars like the W124 and the G-Wagon looked like they were carved from granite. Straight lines, strong shapes. The message was simple: this car is built to last.
Modern Mercedes design moved toward what the company calls sensual purity. This idea tries to blend emotion and intelligence. The design language becomes smoother, more minimal, more liquid. Curves replace edges. Light and shadow define the body, as seen in modern electric models. This shift split the fan base. Some people love the old era because it feels mechanical, durable, honest. Others love the modern era because it feels futuristic, digital, luxurious. And in that split, you see another real psychological truth. Mercedes is not one brand. It is multiple identities fighting inside one logo. Now we enter the war room, because no empire grows without enemies. The Mercedes-BMW rivalry has been described as an automotive Cold War. It's a grill-to-grill battle for the premium market. Historically, people simplify it like this: Mercedes, comfort, luxury, prestige, smooth power. BMW, sporty driving, agility, driver focus. Of course, the reality is more complex, but the perception is powerful. And the rivalry carries one of the most fascinating what-if moments in European industry. In the late 1950s, BMW was in serious trouble after expensive projects failed in the market. There was a period where BMW's future looked uncertain, and a Mercedes takeover was discussed in history circles. Imagine that timeline. If Mercedes absorbed BMW, the entire premium market could have been rewritten. Some of the competition that pushed innovation, the S-Class, the 3 Series, the constant feature wars, might have turned into one big empire with less pressure. But it didn't happen. BMW survived, rebuilt itself, and spent decades attacking Mercedes' dominance. This is not just car rivalry, it's identity warfare. And that kind of rivalry creates the perfect environment for myths, rumors, and secret strategy talk, because every big move looks like a chess move. Then, inside Mercedes itself, there were power struggles, corporate drama, executive eras that felt like Shakespeare. One famous chapter is the era of Jürgen Schrimp, nicknamed Rambo by some workers because of his aggressive style. He pushed global expansion and big deals, and one deal became the most infamous bet-the-company move in Mercedes' modern history, the Chrysler merger. In 1998, Daimler-Benz entered what was publicly called a merger of equals with Chrysler. It was positioned as a global superpower in the making, a new giant that could challenge other massive automakers. But in reality, it became a case study in cultural mismatch. German corporate culture brought strong hierarchy and engineering control. American corporate culture, especially in that era, was more flexible and high risk. Systems didn't align, priorities clashed, trust eroded. The synergy that was promised did not arrive. Instead, the partnership bled value and created years of corporate pain. In the end, Daimler exited the arrangement in a way many people saw as an expensive retreat. This story matters because it reveals the human weakness behind the star. Even a brand that sells the best can chase a dream that turns into a trap. Now, let's talk about marketing, because Mercedes doesn't only build cars, it builds belief. The slogan, "The best or nothing," is not just a promise, it's a psychological weapon. It suggests there are only two categories, the best and worthless. It turns the brand into a reward for success. And over time, this created what people call the cult of the star. Owners don't just buy a vehicle, they buy membership in an idea. They buy entry into a luxury story. And here's something interesting. Mercedes is powerful enough to survive even when pop culture mocks it. Janis Joplin's song Mercedes-Benz was intended as criticism of consumer culture, but it became an anthem people still remember. Mercedes also appears in films and games in both serious and comedic ways. Sometimes it's status, sometimes it's satire. And that's a kind of victory, because even jokes keep the brand alive. Now we turn to the darkest part of the story, the part that cannot be told with glamour. Now we have to open the darkest file in the Mercedes story, because no matter how powerful a brand becomes, history does not disappear. From 1933 to 1945, Daimler-Benz was deeply connected to the Nazi war economy. The company produced vehicles and equipment that supported the regime's military machine. And as the war expanded, the company faced a brutal question: how to keep production running when millions of men were taken to the front.
The answer across Nazi Germany's industry was forced labor, and Daimler-Benz became part of that system. By 1944, company records show that nearly half of the workforce, about 46% of roughly 63,610 employees, were forced laborers, prisoners of war, or concentration camp detainees. In annexed territories, the share could rise even higher, over 70% in some places. These workers were not one group. They came from many countries, especially Poland and the Soviet Union. That means people today would call them Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian, and more. And in several locations, Jewish workers were also forced into labor through Nazi persecution and deportation. They lived under a racist hierarchy. Different groups were treated differently, paid differently, fed differently, and housed differently. Many were forced to work long hours under harsh conditions, with inadequate food and poor shelter. They were controlled, punished, and moved like units of labor, not human beings. One detail shows how organized this exploitation became. Company archives describe how transports from concentration camps were arranged specifically to meet production needs. In other words, labor was not simply found, it was demanded, scheduled, and supplied through a terror system. There is also the story of Daimler-Benz operations in the East. Records describe a massive repair facility in Minsk employing around 5,000 people, including local Jews and deported Belarusian villagers, part of the machinery supporting the German military offensive. This is not a footnote. It shows that the company's role was not limited to a single factory. It was connected to a wider network of wartime production and repair. This part of history is difficult, and it must be said carefully. This does not mean every engineer or worker at Daimler-Benz personally believed in Nazi ideology, but the company, as an institution, benefited from the system and operated inside it. That is the moral reality. After the war, Germany rebuilt, and many corporations tried to reshape their public image. In later decades, initiatives were created to provide humanitarian support and compensation to former forced laborers, including the German foundation known as Remembrance, Responsibility, and Future. Daimler-Benz eventually joined this wider effort, but only much later and not without criticism. So when people look at the Mercedes star and see only luxury, they are missing a hidden layer, because the brand carries two histories at the same time. One history is engineering, speed, and prestige. The other is a shadow, proof that industrial greatness can exist alongside moral catastrophe. That shadow is part of the Mercedes story, whether the brand likes it or not. Another shadow arrived through motorsport tragedy. The 1955 Le Mans disaster remains one of the most infamous tragedies in racing history. A crash during the event caused catastrophic loss of life. The shock changed motorsport safety conversations for decades. Mercedes withdrew from factory-backed racing for many years afterward. We do not need graphic details to understand the point. Speed has consequences, and sometimes the consequences are unbearable. In modern times, controversies shift from war and racing to something different: trust. Across the auto world, diesel emissions and marketing claims became a major legal and reputational battlefield. Mercedes, like other manufacturers, faced investigations and legal action in multiple regions. Exact numbers and settlement totals vary across cases and years, but the theme is consistent. When a brand sells itself as excellence, anything that looks like deception damages the core promise. And that brings us to the financial thriller behind the beauty. Because behind every smooth car commercial is a spreadsheet. Mercedes-Benz Group, formerly Daimler AG, has faced volatility and high-stakes decisions, big mergers, big provisions, big corrections. Some years show strong profit, other years show painful drops in operating results due to market shifts, technology transitions, and strategic misreads. This is an important point for your documentary because it adds tension. Mercedes is not only an engineering story, it is also a story of risk. Risk in products, risk in politics and ethics, risk in racing, risk in mergers, risk in brand promises. And the higher the brand sits, the further it can fall. Now, let's open what I call the quote vault, because quotes reveal personality. When Schrempp called his timing excellent, it sounded like confidence. When the motto says the best or nothing, it sounds like an ultimatum. When a buyer like Jelinek threatens to go back to horse travel, it shows arrogance and impatience. These lines are not just words, they are windows into the culture around the brand, proud, competitive, sometimes ruthless. And this leads into the what-if universe, because Mercedes' history has many doors that almost opened. What if Mercedes had acquired BMW? What if certain prototypes, like the C111, had gone into production? What if Mercedes had never recovered from major public failures? What if the brand had taken a different path in the electric era? These questions matter because they show something people forget. The star was never guaranteed. Mercedes survived because it adapted, because it invested, and because it protected its image, sometimes aggressively. Now, let's do a fast iceberg layer, small facts that feel unreal but reveal how strange the Mercedes universe is. The G-Wagon began as a military idea and became a luxury obsession. A concept car once used a fish-inspired design approach for aerodynamics. In the 1930s, the Silver Arrow stories became part of racing mythology. Mercedes has a long history of unusual partnerships and experimental projects. The company once used special measuring vehicles to collect data before modern computers. Some of these facts are trivia, yes, but trivia matters because it creates the feeling that Mercedes is not only a company, it is a world. Now we arrive at the most important psychological section of your documentary.
Who is the Mercedes buyer? The fan base is not one group. There is the purist who loves old, over-engineered models because they feel honest and mechanical. There is the technocrat who loves screens, lighting, and digital luxury. There's the G-Wagon fan who wants military shape as lifestyle power. There are the collectors who chase rare models as symbols of legacy. And if you listen closely, you hear something deeper. For many people, Mercedes is not transportation, it is identity. It is a public message. I am successful. I am protected. I belong. This is why arguments about Mercedes become emotional. Buttons versus touch controls, old era versus new era, real Mercedes versus modern Mercedes. People are not fighting about a car, they are fighting about what the car means. So after all the myths, theories, scandals, triumphs, and failures, what is the real conclusion? Some people chase conspiracy stories about the logo, secret symbols, hidden orders, coded messages. But the strongest conspiracy, if we even want to call it that, is simpler and more realistic. Mercedes has mastered the art of status engineering. A star that feels like authority, a slogan that feels like destiny, a design language that signals wealth even in silence. It makes people want it. It makes people defend it. It makes people dream about it. And then, when you remember how it all began, the story becomes almost poetic. Because before the corporate wars, before the slogans, before the cult, there was a quiet morning in Mannheim. A woman who refused to wait, a machine that coughed into life, a road that tried to break it, and a simple act of proof that created an industry. Bertha Benz did not only drive a car, she drove the future into existence. Mercedes-Benz is a brand of bright achievements and dark shadows. It is a myth factory and a history lesson. It is engineering, psychology, and power wrapped in metal. The star shines, but it also casts a long shadow. And maybe that's the real reason we cannot stop looking at it.
Hello again, Richie Rich Stories family. I hope you enjoyed this story. If you did, please subscribe to Richie Rich Stories, like the videos, and turn on notifications for more original stories. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you again in the next story.